Hi and welcome. I will start this video with a short story. In Second World War, Germans captured an American-made device that was handheld, portable and quite good at destroying tanks. So they analyzed it and did manage to build their own, and they named it Raketenpanzerbuchse or something like that. My German is not very good, but Americans in their original the original designers, they just called it a bazooka. So similarly, I'm even worse than Germans when it comes to marketing and naming stuff, and so I will be using terms as bicycle centerline and bicycle chainline. But you can call them whatever you want. I will explain them, show everything, and it is not as complicated as it may sound. It just I cannot think of a better way to name them. So in order to understand bicycle chainline, I think that it is important first to understand bicycle centerline. So let us begin. This video, as all my videos, has a table of contents that's visible in the video's description and when you hover your mouse over the timeline, so you can skip to the parts of interest. And I will also put any relevant links in the video's description. For example, I have an article about how to measure and what bicycle chainline is, and this will be a video demonstration, so you can use both ways to learn. But let us start with bicycle centerline. Here we have a bicycle, and in order to be able to ride the bicycle normally, you generally want the front wheel, the steering tube, the seat tube and the rear wheel to all be in line and also in the same plane. So it would not be very good if the seat tube, for example, was not in line and it stood a bit like this. Because if it stood a bit like this, your saddle would be a bit to the side, and in that case your weight would be pulling the bicycle to one side and it would not steer very clearly. I think this concept is best viewed from this angle, so that you look at the bicycle from that side. That is important in order to understand that. So we don't want any of those four things, so the front tire, the head tube or the steering tube, the seat tube and the rear tire to be misaligned. Also, at the same time, it is very important that they are in the same plane. What I mean by that is that we don't want them to be in the same line but put at a certain angle. That would also give us all sorts of steering problems and handling problems. For example, if we take the front wheel, it cannot be sitting like this. If we made the fork to be put at an angle to put it aside, but also even if it is in the middle, we don't want it to be sitting like this. It's obvious, but I think it is important to stress this and explain it. So the bicycle center line is not just one line, it's a plane that is put across the entire symmetrical axis of the bicycle longitudinally. So if I put some sort of a ruler, if the center line were some kind of force, it would be sitting like this, exactly in the middle, and all the way through the bicycle we have that imaginary center line, and that is very important, and I will be calling it center line. You can call it a bazooka if you like. That was the first thing important to understand before we talk about chainline, which is what I will talk about next and explain it and show it. So now that we know what the center line is, chain line is the distance from the middle of the, I will explain it and show it, so the definition may sound a bit more complicated. So it's the distance of the midsection of your front and of your rear chainrings from the bicycle's center line. If you have only so there is the front chain line and the rear chain line, and generally you want them to be the same. So To further and better explain it, I drew some pictures here. Let me show. Okay, sorry about the interruption. So let us continue now. Here I drew the bicycle's middle cross section. So that is this is the, if we cut the tubes along the longitudinal axis of the bicycle, and this is the tubes, their thickness, and let me show what I mean. So this is what we are looking at here, and these are the front chain rings, or one chain ring, it doesn't matter, and this is the cassette. This is a drawing that I put just for helping explaining. So this is the rear hub and the cassette, and the dropouts on the rear are a bit to the sides to take the rear wheel. So now we'll explain what's what. The front chain line is the distance from the bicycle center line to the middle of the front chaining set. If you have only one front chaining, the 1x system, then it's the middle of the front chaining. So it's not very thick, but you want to measure from the middle of it to the middle of the tubes on the bicycle, in this case the seat tube. So that is, if you have 2 or 3, then you want to measure where the middle is and measure the distance from the middle to the middle. That's the front chain line. For the rear chain line, you usually have more than one sprocket at the rear, or you might have one, but it's the same principle. You either measure from the middle of the only sprocket you have, if it's a 1x1 system, single speed, or from the middle of the set of your sprockets. So we want to measure the middle of this to the middle of the frame's center line. However, on the rear we don't have any tubes to measure against, so we will have to do a bit of hacking, but I will show how it's done, how it's measured. To do that, I will place the bike here and do some measurement and show it as a demonstration. But there is also a tricky part that's worth knowing, and those are frames that are called offset frames. Here I drew an offset frame, and the idea with offset frames is that the rear dropouts are not made to be symmetrical relative to the bicycle's center line, but they are put a bit to the right. And here I've explained with this picture why that is done. This is the classic non-offset bicycle frame, and we have the hub, the rear hub that's held between the rear dropouts. We have the width of the cassette, and as you can see, there's not much room, and the right hand side spokes that are coming from the cassette side are almost vertical. That gives them a very poor bracing angle, especially compared to the left hand side spokes, so they need a lot higher tension, and such a wheel is not as strong to lateral sideways loads because of that. That's a problem, a downside. And so for very thick wide cassettes and for frames that need to be used in very rough riding conditions, off-road riding and similar, they invented the offset frames where the chain stays are a bit moved to the side. So your right hand chain stay is more away from the center line than the left hand. So the whole hub is moved a bit sideways, and then we effectively have this. So the cassette is moved to the right, and we have almost the same angle, the same bracing angle for the left and the right hand side spokes. So that is achieved by that. But when it comes to chain line, you can see that this cassette is further out from the bicycle's center line than this one. And so when we are calculating the rear chain line for the offset frames, we need to add the frame offset to all our other measurements. That's what we do in the end. And usually manufacturers specify, when you buy an offset frame or a bicycle with an offset frame, what that offset is, how many millimeters. So that's just an important thing with modern bicycles to consider. Now, why would you want to know anything about chain line? That's an obvious question. Because if you want to do some tuning your bicycle to better suit your needs, to have better shifting or to have the chain last longer and the drive chain last longer, sometimes you don't want to go with the exact chain line, so you want to not make the middle of your front chainings align with the middle of your cassette in terms of how far from the frame center line they are. We'll get to that later, but I think it's a good thing to know and to understand. But first let's show how to measure the chain line. We will start with measuring the front chain line. So the simplest way to measure the front chain line is to first shift to your smallest chaining in the front if you have more than one. And it's a good idea to right away shift to the smallest, to the middle of the cassette at the rear. Just don't put it on the largest chaining. So first thing we do is to remove the chain so it doesn't get in the way. And next we want to measure the distance from the outer side of the outermost chainring. If you have two or three or only one, it doesn't matter. You're measuring from this to the seat tube. And now how do I measure that? I can take a tool like this and try to get it somewhere to sit against the I'm taking calipers and making them sit against the chainring and then measuring the distance to the seat tube. And here you can see the first problem. If I measure at this point, I will get more distance than if I measure from the exact middle. To reduce that problem, you can use a steel ruler. It's not perfectly stiff, but it will be enough because this is not some super precise measurement we're taking. We just want to get the ballpark values. So now I know that it's a relatively flat section. If I move this a bit left, right, I will still get the almost exactly the same distance. So that's the first thing we need to measure. Then we write it down. Then we measure the distance from the innermost chaining. If there are two or three, doesn't matter. We measure the distance from the innermost to the tube. When we have measured that, we need to measure the chaining thickness. This is how it's done most easily. So measuring the chaining thickness. Ideally I want to measure the smallest chaining thickness, but that's practically very impractical to do, and they are usually of the same thickness, and even if there is a margin of error, it's not that crucial. Finally, I want to measure the whole width of the outermost chaining face and the opposite side thickness of the tube. So that's another important measure. And now I need to measure the tube thickness itself along this line where we measured this, because some are oval in shape. So if I'm measuring here, I want to measure at the same, say, angle, so I won't be measuring it this way. Now that we have measured and written it all down, this is what we have in fact measured. Alright, so this is the distance from the face of the outermost chaining to the bicycle frame. Yes, we did add a ruler here, but that will not be important in this case. Then we measure the distance from the innermost chaining. Doesn't matter if we have two or three, to our ruler or to the tube. So when we subtract this distance, the larger one, from the smaller one, we will get almost the thickness of our chainring set, but not quite, because here is what we have effectively measured. So we have this distance and we have this distance. We need to add the thickness of one chaining to get what we actually need, and that is the outermost distance, so the full width. I hope I've explained that clearly. So the first thing that we measure, and the second thing, we will reduce the measurement I noted as C1, and we will subtract the measurement C2 from that and add the thickness of a chaining, and that will give us the whole width of our front chainings that we marked here as C. It is very often not practical and not possible to accurately measure directly on your front chaining set. On your cranks there are some chain covers sometimes. In this case it's very easy. Here I don't have any sort of gadgets, anything, but modern ones often have all sorts of things here, and it's not very easy to measure accurately. So that's why I did not resort to this, but this is what we are trying to get the thickness of the whole set. That's what I'm trying to measure. But if you cannot do that directly, if your calipers are not too long, if the difference between the largest and the smallest chaining is too huge, or you have other things protruding, this is the more complicated but quite precise and accurate way to get it. So we measure the outermost chaining face from the tube, the innermost, and then we add we subtract the innermost from the outermost dimension, and we add the thickness of one chaining, and then we got what I marked as C. That is our front chaining thickness. Next, what I measured was this complete. I marked it as A. So the distance from the left side of the seat tube to the outermost chaining. So I marked that as A. And finally I marked the thickness of the seat tube. I marked that as B. So when we have A, we want to get the distance from the middle to the middle. So when we have all this, that's A, we subtract the half width of the front chaining set, so that is C divided by 2, and then we also subtract this section, that is half thickness of the seat tube, because we only care about this distance. So we are subtracting half of the chaining thickness and half of the seat tube thickness, and that's how we get the front chain line. If you can read the article I wrote and also rewind the video and watch again. I try to explain the basics because bikes differ and the geometry and measurements don't. So it's important to just figure out how you can most accurately measure. For example, I used a steel ruler that is just under 1 millimeter thick, but effectively it did not affect my measurement because it sits here. It makes the same, it reduces both C1 and C2 by the same amount, and all I care about is the difference between those two. I don't care about the absolute values in this case, so it did not affect my measurement. It in fact increased the precision because it gave me a flat surface to measure against. So that's for the front chain line. Now, how do you measure the rear chain line? That is a bit more tricky. There you want to get this distance from the middle of the cassette to the middle of your chain center line. But what about offset frames? Well, we will measure always as if it's not an offset frame and then just add the amount of offset. So I'll start with a simpler explanation, and then we can just add a bit at the end for the offset frames. This will be the only way you can measure it accurately and also simpler to understand at the same time. So we want the distance from the middle of the whole free hub over lock nut distance. That's what we're working with, because on the frame I don't have any reference points to measure to know where the center of the wheel is easily. That is why I am using the hub itself. So I want the middle of the hub. I will take that as the middle of the frame. It usually is. On offset frames we will just at the end add the offset. So that's the middle of the frame's center line. And we want to measure that distance from the center of the cassette set, the set of your rear sprockets. How do we measure that? I will first measure this, what I call B. That is the distance from the frame's right hand side dropout, where the cassette sits, to the beginning of the cassette. Let's show how I would measure that. So I will take calipers and use this side. I have also a video showing how to use these. I will also put it in the video's description. So I'm measuring from we can move camera over here to better catch this. So I want to measure the distance from the inside of the frame to the start of the cassette. And so this is the measurement that I'm taking. And here I got about 3 millimeters. However, as you can probably see, I measured also the thickness of the lock ring, because I cannot accurately measure from this point up where the lock ring is away, because there I don't have it aligned with my frame in this case. It's not easy to take a precise measurement. So I'm measuring from the inside of the frame to the face of the lock ring. That is the first measurement I take. Now let us move here. So when I took that measurement, I also need to remove the wheel from the bicycle. That was the only measurement we did with the wheel on the bicycle. We removed the wheel and we removed the cassette. And we put it on some flat surface. And we put the lock ring in place, because lock ring teeth will engage with the smallest sprocket's teeth. And so if we only measure this thickness, it will be a bit off, a bit thicker than it really is when it's on the cassette. So we want to measure when it's seated in to the teeth, and then we measure from the face of the lock ring to the face of the sprocket. And here I got about 1.5 millimeters, 1.45, 47. So that's with this cassette. So we need to have that information. So the thickness of the lock ring on the cassette and the distance that we measured on the bike. When we add the thickness of the lock ring to the distance we measured on the bike, we get what I marked here as B. So that is where the sprocket starts, where the important thing relevant for our measurement of chainline starts. So the measurement on the bike plus the thickness of the lock ring, that gives us B. So that is how far away from the end of the hub the cassette starts, from the lock nut. Even if you don't have a cassette hub with lock nuts, that face that sits on the inside of the frame, this is what I mean. So in this case, on the right hand side, I have these washers and everything, but this is where it's seated against the frame. So this is called lock nut. In this case, it really is a lock nut. Sometimes it's just an end cap, but that's the place where the important measurements start. So we have measured that, and we call it B. Now we need to measure the cassette thickness or the cassette height. To do that, you dismount the cassette, put it on something flat, and just measure it. This is soft, and it will not give me an accurate reading, but I'm just showing the principle. So I want to have this part hit the bottom when this is sitting on something flat and preferably not soft. Okay. So I got the full thickness, and when I measure that, I need to, of course, subtract the thickness of the lock ring, or I can measure it without the lock ring right away. That's even simpler. So that is the height of the cassette, but there is another catch. Some cassettes on the rear have some things protruding. So when you put the cassette on something, it is not sitting flush. The largest chainring is not sitting on the surface, but it is a bit higher. And when that is the case, you flip it and you measure the distance from that, whatever thingy it is, some spider or some sort of small like rods or similar. You measure the distance from that to the cassette chainring itself, and you subtract that from the thickness that you measured when you did this measurement, because you just want the thickness of your sprocket set and nothing more. And that measurement is called C in this 3-year-old's drawing. So we have B and we have C. And finally we need to measure the over lock nut distance, or the distance between the frame's dropouts when we mount the wheel inside. And this is how you measure that. So when you remove the cassette, you can use calipers to place them inside and to take just find the right spot. Okay. I'm trying to get the calipers to to be able to reach the lock nuts, and I'm having a bit of a trouble here, and that's good. Here I did manage to get it in place, but even if I didn't, if it's a strangely laced wheel, what I could do is to just eyeball it to make sure that I'm looking parallel and these are aligned. That's very imprecise, but you can get the measurement. In this case I got 134.29, and the nominal width of the mountain bike rear hubs is often 135 millimeters, so I did not make too much of a mistake. I have a separate article about rear hubs and their widths and the booster hubs and all the other stuff. I will also put it in the video description if I don't forget. So here, so we call that A, that's over lock nut distance. And now to get the rear chain line, we need to measure the middle of the cassette. How far away is it from the frame center line? So to get the frame center line, we just need to divide our over lock nut distance by 2. That's half the width of the hub, and that is A divided by 2. So that's the first thing that's what I wrote down here. So then we get this when we divide 8 by 2. A, not 8. Okay, so next we need to subtract the B that we also measured, along with that taking into consideration the thickness of that lock nut and everything else. So we have B, we need to subtract it, and now we need to subtract just half of the cassette set width. So we subtract C divided by 2, and if the frame is not an offset frame, we will get the rear chain line. If the frame is an offset one, so the whole cassette is moved a bit further to the right, then we need to add that offset, because that is by how much the center of the cassette along with the whole cassette, of course, will be moved further to the right. And that is the How I Met Your Mother. That is the rear chain line. And we need to have the front chain line and the rear chain line be as close to each other as possible in theory. Now, as I like to joke, theory is when everything is known but nothing works, and practice is when everything works but no one knows why. And in BikeGremlin garage I combine practice and theory, so nothing works and no one knows why. Okay, so now let's look at my bicycle that I built, assembled, and whose chain line is completely off. These are the measurements that I got for my bicycle, and I will explain why. So the A for the front chain line is 66.7, B is 28.6, the thickness of the tube. It's a steel frame, the tubes are slim, and this is B divided by half, 14.3, and then we have the C1 measurement 36.2, the C2 is 30, that's including my ruler that I used, and the thickness of a chaining is 2.9 millimeters, and so C1 minus C2 plus the thickness gives us 9.1, and then we divide it by 2 to get the mid section, to get where this is at, and that is 4.5 millimeters rounded down. And what did I write here? Yes, I wrote out, so A minus C, 1/2 of C minus 1/2 of B, and that gave us this this distance. Just a second. 66 minus C half minus B half. Yes, that gave us the 47.9 front chain line. That is correct. And for the rear chain line, I got measurements for B at 4.5 millimeters, and I got the cassette width at 34.6, so half is 17.3. And of course I use comma instead of a dot for writing down in my native. and we have the hub width, which is 130.5 millimeters. That's what I measured, that's what it is, and half of that is 65.2, so A half minus B minus C half gives us 65.2 minus 4.5 minus 17.3, which is 43.4. So that's a lot less than 47. So my cassette is, my chainings are a lot further out than the middle of my cassette. Why is that a good thing? Let me show you. We'll take a look at the bike, get the chain back on, and we'll look at it from a different angle, like this. Okay, so these cranks, the larger one is 53 teeth, the smaller one is 42 teeth. I am no longer in my prime strength, and so for me the 42 teeth chaining is the one I use most of the time. 53 is too big for me, except when I'm going a bit on a downhill. And I mostly ride this on flats and very mild inclines. And so what I wanted to achieve by using a longer axle for the bottom bracket that allowed me to move my chainings a bit further out, what that allowed me to do is to have the chain be parallel and not put at a huge angle when I'm using the middle of the cassette, which is what I usually use for riding. If I had put the front chain line by the book, so to move the chainings a bit further in, then my chain would be at a huge angle when I am using the few sprockets that I use most of the time. Of course, this comes with some downsides. When I shift to the largest rear chaining, if I'm climbing a very steep hill, then my chain is at a greater angle than it would have been had I put my chainings a bit further in. That is the biggest downside. As far as the using outer chaining, when I'm going downhill, I usually will use the smallest few sprockets, so in that case chain is not at a huge angle. It's even better than it would have been had I put the cranks by the book, because then it would be a bit slightly outwards. So it has its pros, it has its cons, but if you know what you're doing, if you take all the measurements, you can deliberately make a, let's say, a mistake, deliberately make it off from the ideal, but only when you know what you're doing, not by mistake. And if this were some normal front chaining combination, then this chain line would be wrong, and I would have considered it to be a mistake and would be looking for a shorter axle for the bottom bracket. So that's a practical explanation of, I hope it all now fits into place, and I hope you can understand why this is important and how it is measured and how you can, say, play with it. There is another important catch when it comes to the front chain line. Front derailleurs have a limited amount of how far out and how close in they can move. Yes, they do have bolts that you can use for limiting their motion, but even if you unscrew them to give them the maximum possible amount of motion, there is a limit of how far out and how close in they can, the front derailleurs can move. And so if you get your front chain line too far off or too close to the bicycle, you may not be able to set your shifting to shift properly to the largest or to the smallest chaining. So that's another important thing to check and double check when you are, especially when you are going for a deliberately offset front chain line. The rear chain line cannot be played with in such a simple way by just using different washers or using different length of axles, or by mounting the chainings on a different, for 1x drivetrains, you can mount the chainings on different sides of the spider of the mounts, or use some washers to move it a bit to fine-tune your chain line. Sometimes that's necessary. And so with the front derailleurs, you have limits by how far you can play with that. Even if you want to go crazy, you might not be able to set the shifting properly. So that's one of the reasons when you cannot figure out why you cannot set your front shifting, to also check the chain line. Also, if you make it extremely off, either by putting the front chainings too close or too far out, your chaining might be at a huge angle very often, and so your shifting and your drive tangle longevity may be diminished, reduced, however. So those are the catches and gotchas. While on the rear it's very difficult to make those adjustments because hubs are built as they are built and they need to sit in the frame, and sometimes you can add some washers on one side and play with it. That's more of a hack and a topic for a completely separate video. I think I made some video about using modern hubs with vintage frames and so on. I have some articles and videos on that, but I will not go any further. I think this is already a quite long video, but I hope that I've explained everything clearly. Of course, if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. You can also support me on Patreon, patreon.com/BikeGremlin. That's also helpful and welcome. And if you have any corrections, questions or comments, use the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in some other video. Cheers and stay cool.